Brian kept saying, "I'll come home next month." And back home, his mother never blamed him. She only placed another container in the freezer, put a small label on it, and wrote, "For when he comes." Oh, hello, my friend. Thank you for coming back and sitting with me today. I don't know if you have ever said something like this. "I'll come home next month," or "This weekend is just too busy. Maybe around the holidays. Once work settles down, I'll come visit." Those sentences sound so ordinary. There is nothing cruel in them. Sometimes we really are busy, really tired, really carrying more than people can see. Sometimes we truly believe that if we just push something back a little, everything will be all right. And deep down, we still love the people back home. We have not forgotten them. We still call. We still send gifts. We still ask how they are doing. We still believe we will go back soon. It is just that sometimes a trip home gets postponed once, then twice, then 3 times. And before we know it, postponing becomes a habit. And the strange thing is, the people waiting for us often do not complain. They simply say, "It's okay. Work is important. Come when you can." They say it so gently that we almost believe they are not disappointed. Today I want to tell you about a man named Brian Parker. Brian was not an uncaring son. He was a good son, a good husband, a good father, a man trying to live responsibly. But for years, Brian kept postponing a trip home, not because he did not love his parents, but because he kept thinking home would still be there, his parents would still be there, and next month, surely, he would go. Brian Parker was 47 years old. He lived with his wife, Rachel, and their 2 teenage children in a suburb outside Chicago. From the outside, Brian's life looked steady. A good job at an insurance company, a house with a small backyard, 2 children growing up quickly, a car that always needed some kind of maintenance, a mortgage that still had years left on it, and a calendar that always seemed fuller than he wanted it to be. Brian was not a man who complained much. He had become used to carrying many things at once, driving the kids to school, going to the office, sitting through meetings, answering emails, calling clients, solving small problems that somehow became urgent. By the end of the day, coming home late for dinner, asking the kids a few questions about school, checking tomorrow's schedule, then going to sleep with unfinished things still moving around in his mind. Like many adults, Brian often told himself, once this season passes, once this project is over, once the kids' schedules slow down, once Rachel is less busy, once work settles a little, once we finally get a free weekend, then he would have time. Time to rest, time to sit still, time to take the family somewhere, time to visit his parents. Brian's parents lived in a small town in Iowa, the town where he had grown up. A short main street, a little diner that opened at 6 in the morning, a red brick church on the corner, an old baseball field behind the high school, and cornfields stretching along both sides of the road as you drove out of town. Brian's father was named George. He was 73. He had worked for more than 30 years at a factory that made farm equipment. George was not a talkative man. He liked sitting on the porch in the late afternoon, drinking black coffee, watching cars go by. Brian's mother was named Elaine. She was 71. She had worked at the town library before she retired. Even after retirement, Elaine kept everything in order. Books arranged neatly on the shelves, bills kept in the right drawer, a family calendar hanging on the refrigerator, and in the freezer. There were always a few meals she had made ahead, not because anyone asked her to. It was just the kind of thing Elaine did. She felt better knowing there was always something in the house that could be warmed up, just in case someone stopped by. George and Elaine's house was the house Brian had grown up in. A white house with a low front porch, 2 wooden chairs near the door, an old apple tree in the backyard, and in the kitchen, the same round wooden table where Brian used to do homework when he was a boy. Whenever Brian called home, his mother often asked, "Do you think you'll be able to come this weekend?" She did not ask every time, but she asked often enough that the question became part of their calls. Brian usually answered, "I'm not sure, Mom," or "Emma has volleyball," or "Josh has driving practice," or Things are pretty busy at work right now. Elaine always replied in a soft voice. That's all right, honey. Come when you can. George was usually somewhere nearby. Sometimes Brian could hear him in the background saying, if he's busy, he's busy. It was not cold. It was not meant to make Brian feel bad. It was George's way of keeping his son from feeling guilty. Then Elaine would add, your father's right. Take care of what you need to take care of. Home will still be here. Home will still be here. That sentence sounded so safe. Safe enough that Brian believed it would always be true. The first time Brian postponed his trip home that year was in March. Elaine called on a Wednesday evening. Brian, if you're free this Sunday, I was thinking of making pot roast. It's been a long time since we all sat down together. Brian was standing in his own kitchen, holding the phone in one hand and opening his laptop with the other. An email from his boss had just come in. Something needed to be ready for Monday morning. Brian looked at the family calendar on the wall. Emma had a volleyball game on Sunday. Josh had a driving lesson. Rachel had written groceries and laundry. In the corner, Brian let out a small breath. This Sunday's probably tough, Mom. We're packed this weekend. Elaine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that's okay. I just thought I'd ask. I'll come home next month. All right. Next month is fine. Brian could hear the smile in her voice. Your father will be happy if you come. He keeps saying the chair on the porch is loose, but he won't let anyone fix it. Brian smiled. Dad is still Dad. Yes, Elaine said. He is. Brian said, I'll look at it when I come. Elaine answered, I'll tell him to save it for you. The call ended. Brian set the phone down, and he really did believe he would go next month. But April came and went. A sudden work trip, Josh getting sick for a few days, a weekend of heavy rain, a parent meeting that got moved. And just like that, the trip home was pushed back, not by one big decision, just by small things getting in the way life often does. By June, Elaine called again. Do you think you might come this weekend? Brian was driving home from work. The highway was crowded. Rain clouds were gathering ahead. He had the phone on speaker. This weekend I'll have to see Mom. We're preparing for an internal review at work. Elaine said, oh, then take care of work. No, I'll try. If not this weekend, then early July. Oh, that's fine. Then she added, your father planted tomatoes in the backyard. He says if you come, he'll send some home with you. Brian smiled. Dad planted tomatoes? He says if he retires and doesn't do anything, his joints will lock up. From somewhere in the background, Brian heard George call out, don't tell him everything I say. Elaine laughed. Your father is embarrassed. Brian laughed too. For a moment he felt warm inside. He could picture his father in the backyard, wearing his old baseball cap, bending over a row of tomato plants. He could picture his mother in the kitchen, holding the phone, talking to her son, while looking out the window at her husband. A very ordinary picture. And because it was ordinary, it made Brian feel as if there was still plenty of time. He said, I'll come soon. Elaine answered, I know you will. But early July came, and Josh had his driver's test. Mid-July came, and Rachel had to visit her sister after surgery. Late July came, and Brian had to work through the weekend. So he called home again. Mom, I think I'll have to make it next month. Elaine only said, that's all right. Summer is still long. Summer is still long. That sounded safe too. But summer, like every season, does not stand still and wait for us. One evening near the end of August, Brian came home late from work. Rachel was cleaning the kitchen. Emma was at the dining table doing homework. Josh was upstairs. On the table, there was a small envelope. Rachel said, your mom sent that. Brian took off his jacket and picked it up. Inside were a few printed photographs. Elaine still liked printing pictures, even though Brian had told her many times that she could just send them by phone. The first photo was of George standing in the backyard, beside the tomato plants. He was wearing a baseball cap and a plaid shirt, one hand on his hip, the other holding a red tomato. The second photo was of the porch chair. It had been fixed, not beautifully. A new piece of wood had been attached under one side. A few screws were not perfectly straight. On the back of the photo, Elaine had written, "Your father fixed it himself. Couldn't wait until July." Brian read the sentence. He gave a small laugh, but the laugh faded sooner than he expected. Couldn't wait until July. It was not an accusation, just a sentence, but something inside Brian lowered a little. Rachel stood by the sink, watching him. "What is it?" Brian handed her the photo. "I told Mom I'd come in July and fix that chair for Dad." Rachel read the back of the picture. Then she looked at him. "You can still go." "I know." Brian said it. Then he set the photo on the table, opened his laptop, and answered one more email before bed. Fall came. The days in Chicago grew shorter. The tree in front of Brian's house turned yellow. The family calendar grew even fuller. Emma was preparing college applications. Josh was driving more. Rachel had more responsibility at work. Brian had been given a project that would stretch into the end of the year. One Sunday evening, Elaine called on video. Brian was a little surprised. His parents rarely used video calls. He answered. His mother's face appeared on the screen. Elaine was sitting in the kitchen. The warm light above the table made her gray hair look almost silver. "Can you see me?" "I can see you, Mom." "Where's your father?" "He's out on the porch." "Let me get him." Elaine turned the phone slowly. The picture shook a little. Brian saw the old kitchen, the refrigerator with state magnets on it, the wall clock, the round table where he used to eat cereal before school. Then his mother walked toward the door. "George, Brian's on video." George stepped into the frame. He stood too close to the phone. Brian could see mostly his forehead and his glasses. "Dad, back up a little." George frowned. "Like this?" Brian laughed. "Yeah, almost." George sat down, and when he did, Brian noticed that he held the edge of the table with one hand. Slowly, very slowly, not like a sick man, just like a man who was older than he had been the last time Brian really looked. That made Brian go quiet. Elaine asked, "What is it?" "Nothing," Brian said quickly. "Dad, you doing okay?" George answered, "I'm fine." Elaine sat beside him. "Your father doesn't drive much at night anymore." George looked at her. "I can still drive." "I didn't say you couldn't. You just don't like driving after dark." George did not answer. Brian looked at his father through the screen. He remembered the years when George drove through snowstorms without hesitation. He remembered his father driving the old pickup along dark country roads, one hand steady on the wheel. And now, his father did not like driving at night anymore. There was nothing dramatic about it, but it made time suddenly visible to Brian. Not on a calendar, on his father's body. Elaine turned back to Brian. "Do you think you might come in October?" "It doesn't have to be for anything. I'm just asking." Brian looked at the calendar on his desk. October was almost full, but this time, he did not answer right away. He looked at his parents on the screen, his father leaning slightly in his chair, his mother holding the phone with both hands. Behind them, the old kitchen was still there, the way it had always been. Brian said, "Let me look at the schedule and get back to you." Elaine smiled. "That's all right. No rush. No rush." Brian heard that, and for the first time, it did not sound as light as it used to. Near the end of October, Brian received a text from his mother. It was only a picture. No question. No complaint. In the photo was the round kitchen table back home. On it sat an apple pie, a red checkered towel, 2 plates, and a plastic container with a small label on top. For Brian, Elaine wrote underneath, "I made apple pie today. Your father said to save you some in the freezer." Brian looked at the message for a long time. Then he replied, "Looks great, Mom. I'll come soon." Elaine answered, "That's all right, honey. I can save it. I can save it." Brian set the phone down. For some reason, that sentence stayed with him all evening. In November, Brian's company entered its busiest stretch of the year. The project grew. Meetings stacked up. A coworker left, and part of that work was passed to everyone else. Brian worked late several nights a week. Thanksgiving came closer. Rachel asked, "Are we going to Iowa this year?" Brian was sitting at the dining table with his laptop open. "I want to. I just don't know if I can get away." Rachel did not scold him. She only looked at him and said, "Oh, you've been saying that since spring." Brian looked up. At first he wanted to defend himself, to say she knew what work was like, to say it was not that simple, to say he was tired too. But Rachel had not said it harshly. She had only said something true. Brian looked down at his calendar. Then he said quietly, "I know." Rachel sat across from him. "Your parents aren't getting any younger." Brian closed the laptop. That was not new information. Everyone knows that. But there are some truths we know in our heads for a long time before our hearts are finally willing to hear them. Rachel continued, "It doesn't have to be Thanksgiving. It doesn't have to be all of us. You could go by yourself on some ordinary weekend." Brian was quiet. An ordinary weekend. No holiday. No birthday. No special reason. Just go home. The idea was so simple that he felt almost ashamed for not doing it sooner. The next week, Brian drove to Iowa by himself. He did not tell his parents ahead of time, not because he wanted some grand surprise, but because he knew if he called first, his mother would cook too much, clean too much, and turn it into an occasion. He wanted to come home on an ordinary day. On Saturday morning, he left at 6. Chicago was still dark. The highway was quieter than usual. On the passenger seat, he had a bag of the coffee his mother liked, a box of donuts for his father, and the old jacket Brian had borrowed from George years ago and never returned. As he drove out of the city, Brian felt something strange. Work was still there. Emails would still arrive. The project was still not finished. Things at home still needed him. But that morning, he was going home. That was all. Not traveling for work. Not running an errand. Not driving someone somewhere. Just going home. 3.5 hours later, Brian turned onto the familiar road into town. Everything looked both the same and different. The old gas station had a new sign. The diner on the corner was still there. The baseball field behind the high school looked smaller than he remembered. The trees along the road were taller. When Brian pulled into his parents' driveway, George was in the backyard, bending over a few covered plants. Elaine was in the kitchen, her back turned to the window. Brian turned off the car, sat still for 1 second, then stepped out. George looked up first. He stared at Brian. For a few seconds, his face seemed to be catching up with what he was seeing. Then he said, "What are you doing here?" Brian smiled. "I came home." George stood up straight. He did not run over. He did not hug him right away. He only wiped his hands on his pants and said, "Your mother's in the kitchen." But Brian saw the corner of his father's mouth tremble just a little. A few seconds later, Elaine opened the back door. Maybe George had called inside. She stood in the doorway, a dish towel over one shoulder. "Brian?" He held up the bag of coffee. "I brought you coffee." Elaine lifted one hand to her mouth. She did not cry loudly. She only stood there for a moment, as if she needed 1 second to believe that her son was really in the backyard. Then she stepped down from the porch and hugged him. Brian held his mother, and he realized she felt smaller than he remembered. Not because she had changed overnight, but because he had not stood close enough in months to notice how she had been changing. George stood beside them, looking away. Then he said, "Come inside, it's cold." That was George's way of saying, "I'm glad you're here." Brian heard it. This time, he heard it. In the kitchen, Elaine asked if he had eaten breakfast. Brian said he had. She took out a plate anyway. "You can have a little something." George set the donut box on the table. "This for me?" Brian nodded. "The kind you like." George opened the box and looked inside. "Maple glazed." "Yeah," George said. "Good." Just one word. But in the Parker house, that was nearly the highest praise available. Brian sat down at the round wooden table. It was still the same table. A few old scratches on the surface. A small burn mark in one corner from when Brian was 12 and set a hot pan down where he shouldn't have. One leg slightly loose, but still holding. Elaine placed coffee in front of him. "You really didn't tell us you were coming. I was afraid you'd do too much." She smiled. "I always have food," George said. "Of course she does. That freezer could feed a football team." Elaine shook her head. "He exaggerates." But after breakfast, when Elaine opened the freezer to take out some apple pie, Brian saw it. Plastic containers stacked neatly inside. Several of them had small labels. Chili. Brian likes this. Apple pie. For when he comes. Pot roast. March. Tomato sauce. Dad's tomatoes. Brian stood in front of the freezer, silent. Elaine was reaching for a container. When she noticed him staring, she said quickly, "I just cook extra sometimes. Don't make anything of it." Brian looked at the labels. March. Dad's tomatoes. For when he comes. He remembered March. The pot roast. The promise to come in July. The picture of apple pie in October. All the times he had said next time seemed to be sitting there quietly, inside small plastic containers. No blame, no noise, just saved. Brian swallowed. "Mom, why did you save all this?" Elaine gave a small smile. "Well, when you come, I like having things you enjoy." Brian looked at her. "What if I don't come?" Elaine closed the freezer door, very gently. "Then your father and I eat it eventually." She said it in an ordinary voice, but Brian heard the silence underneath. He wanted to apologize right then, but the apology felt too large, and the kitchen was too normal. So he only said, "I'd like to eat whatever you want to make today." Elaine looked at him, then smiled. "Then I'll warm up the chili." George was sitting at the table, opening the newspaper. June chili or October chili? Elaine looked at him. George did not look up. "I'm just asking." Brian laughed. Elaine laughed too. And there, in the old kitchen, the thing that had made Brian's throat tighten became a little lighter, not because it no longer hurt, but because they were still there to laugh together. That afternoon, Brian fixed the hinge on the back door for his father. It was not a big job. A screwdriver, a few new screws, 15 minutes. George stood nearby watching. "You're turning it a little crooked." Brian said, "You want to do it?" "No. I'm supervising." Brian laughed. When he finished, he opened and closed the door a few times. "That should do it." George nodded. "Good." Brian wiped his hands. Then the two of them sat on the porch. The air was cold, but the sun was out. The old apple tree in the backyard had lost most of its leaves. On the small table between the chairs were 2 cups of coffee. George looked out across the yard. "Yard looks bad this time of year." Brian said, "Looks the same to me." "You haven't looked at it in a while." Brian turned toward him. George had not said it with blame, only as a fact. Brian looked down at the coffee in his hands. "I know." They sat quietly for a while. Then Brian said, "I'm sorry I kept saying I'd come and then didn't." George did not look at him right away. He picked up his coffee, took a sip, then said, "You have your own life." "I know, but I should have come sooner." George looked toward the street. "Nobody said you weren't busy." Brian said, "But busy shouldn't become the reason forever." George was quiet. A car drove by slowly. Inside the kitchen, Elaine was opening a cabinet, getting ready for dinner. After a while, George said, "Your mother cooks extra." Brian gave a soft laugh. "I saw. She says it's in case you come." George paused. "Other people can eat it. Your aunt, a neighbor, whoever stops by. But she still puts your name on the containers." Brian lowered his head. George continued, "She doesn't want you to feel bad." Brian asked quietly, "And you?" George looked at him. "I eat the chili." Brian laughed. George laughed too, just a little. Then he added, "But I like it when you come." Brian heard that. It was not a long sentence. It was not a complaint, but it went straight into him. Brian said, "I'll come more often." George looked at him. "Don't say more often if you're not sure." Brian was quiet. George continued, "Say when you're coming, then come." That was very much his father. Not poetic, not soft, not dramatic, just clear. Brian nodded. "All right." He took out his phone, opened his calendar. 3 weeks from now, Saturday, I'll come for the day. George looked at the screen. "For what?" Brian said. "For nothing." George frowned. "You're driving 3.5 hours for nothing." Brian smiled. "Yes." George looked back toward the yard, then said, "Good." Another single word. But this time Brian understood it as happiness. That night Elaine warmed up chili. No one said which month it was from. Brian did not ask. The three of them sat around the round wooden table. Elaine put cornbread on a plate. George added too much pepper, as always. Brian ate slowly, not because the chili was more special than any other meal, but because he knew it had been saved. After dinner, Elaine brought out apple pie. "There's only a little left," George said. "Because I ate some in October." Elaine tapped his hand lightly. "George." Brian laughed. The kitchen filled with small sounds, spoons touching plates, water running as Elaine rinsed her hands, a chair sliding gently across the floor, George clearing his throat and saying the pie was still good. Nothing big happened. No speech, no dramatic promise, only a grown son sitting in the old kitchen, a little longer than usual, not checking the time, not opening his laptop, not rushing to think about when he had to drive back. Around 8 o'clock, Brian got ready to leave. Elaine packed him a container of chili, a container of apple pie, and a small bag of late-season tomatoes that George said were still good enough for sauce. Brian said, "Mom, I'm only driving a few hours. You don't have to send all this." Elaine answered, "Take it home for Rachel and the kids." George stood by the door. "It'll be dark. Be careful around Cedar County." Brian nodded. "I will." Elaine hugged him. This time Brian held her a little longer. Not too long, just longer, long enough to feel how small her shoulders had become. Inside his arms. When he let go, Elaine touched his cheek. "Thank you for coming home." Brian felt his throat tighten. "I should have come sooner." Elaine shook her head. "But you came today." That was all. No blame, no mention of the months before. Only, "You came today." George handed him the old jacket Brian had brought back. "This is still good." Brian smiled. "I thought it was yours." "It is." "Then why are you giving it to me?" George shrugged. "You forget coats." Brian held the jacket. For a few seconds he said nothing. Then he said, "Thanks, Dad." George nodded. "Text us when you get home." Brian looked at him. He had heard that sentence all his life. During school years, after nighttime drives, at the end of short calls, through years when he thought he still had endless chances to return. This time he heard it differently. "I will." Brian drove back to Chicago. In the dark, in the back seat were the containers his mother had packed. Beside him was his father's old jacket. Outside the window, dark fields passed by. Nothing unusual happened on the road. Highway signs, headlights ahead, a gas station near an exit, a construction zone, a light rain beginning as he came closer to the city. But inside Brian, the drive felt different. He thought about the freezer, the containers with his name on them, his mother closing the door gently and saying, "Then your father and I eat it eventually." His father sitting on the porch and saying, "Say when you're coming, then come." Brian did not feel condemned. He felt reminded, gently reminded, that home may still be there, but the people inside it are growing older. That love cannot only be remembered in the mind. Sometimes it has to be placed on the calendar, driven toward, sat down with, held for a little while in an old kitchen, eaten slowly from a bowl of chili that had once been saved. When Brian reached his house, Rachel had left the porch light on. He turned off the car, sat still for a moment, then took out his phone and texted his parents. "Made it home. Thank you for today. I'll be back in 3 weeks." A minute later, Elaine replied, "I'm so glad. Sleep well, honey." Then another message came in from George. 4 words. "Good. Keep your word." Brian looked at the message and smiled. He knew his father did not write much, but 4 words were enough. He carried the chili into the house. Rachel was standing in the kitchen. "How was it?" Brian set the food on the counter. He thought for a moment, then said, "I think I let next month go on too long." Rachel looked at him. She did not say anything. Brian opened one of the containers of apple pie. The smell of cinnamon moved softly through the kitchen. He said, "I'm going back in 3 weeks." Rachel smiled. "I know." Brian looked at her. "I put it on the calendar." And this time, he really had. 3 weeks later, Brian went back. He did not bring much. He did not need a reason. He just went for the day. He changed the light bulb outside the garage for his father. ate sandwiches with his mother, walked with George into the backyard to look at the garden beds, resting for winter, and went home with a container of soup Elaine had made too much of. The month after that, he went again. It was not always easy. Some weekends he could not make it. Some months work was too heavy. Sometimes his own children needed him. Life does not become simple just because we realize what matters. But Brian no longer let the words next month drift, without a date attached to them. If he said next month, he opened the calendar. If he could not come, he called early, not at the last minute, not after his mother had already prepared too much. Some weeks, he simply stayed on a video call a little longer. Some weeks, he ordered groceries to be delivered to his parents' house. Some weeks, he asked his mother, "What are you making this week?" Elaine would laugh. "What, are you placing an order?" Brian would say, "No. I just want to know what home is having for dinner." It was a small question, but Elaine liked it, because sometimes when someone lives far away, they cannot always come home, but they can still make the people at home feel like they belong to each other's lives. One late winter afternoon, Brian arrived and found George already sitting on the porch. The two wooden chairs were placed side by side. The chair that had once been loose was solid now. George was holding 2 cups of coffee, one for himself, one for Brian. Brian sat down. "You made me coffee?" George looked toward the street. "Knew you were coming." Brian held the cup in both hands. Father and son sat quietly. No need to talk much. In front of them was the small town road. Behind them was the White House. Inside, Elaine was opening the cabinet for plates. Nothing special was happening, just an ordinary afternoon. But Brian understood that sometimes ordinary afternoons are exactly what we have been postponing for too long. The following spring, Brian came home on a Saturday morning. This time he had told his parents 2 weeks in advance, not so his mother could over-prepare, but so they would have a real day to look forward to. When he walked into the kitchen, Elaine was standing by the refrigerator. She was placing a small label on a container of soup. Brian saw the words. It did not say, "For when he comes." It said, "For Saturday." Brian stood still. Elaine turned around and noticed him looking. She seemed a little embarrassed. "I was going to send that home with you for Rachel and the kids." Brian nodded. He did not speak right away. He only stepped forward and hugged his mother from behind. Elaine laughed softly. "What is this for?" Brian said, "Nothing." But it was not nothing. It was many things, because someday had become Saturday, because when you come had become a real date, because in that old kitchen, Brian understood that sometimes repairing something in a family does not require a grand promise, only one day kept. You know, what stays with me most in Brian's story is not only the food in the freezer, it is the love behind it. A mother cooking a little extra, a father fixing the porch chair, and still waiting for his son to come sit in it. An old kitchen where something can always be warmed up. A gentle sentence, "Come when you can." I think that sentence has been said in many families, not as blame, not to make children feel guilty, but because the people at home do not want to ask for too much. They know their children are busy. They know life is not easy. They know that between work, children, bills, appointments, and responsibilities, even one trip home can take a lot of effort. But I think sometimes we need to remember this. Home will still be here. Does not mean everything will always stay the same. The table may still be there. The kitchen may still be there. The road home may still be there. But parents grow older quietly, slowly, so slowly that if we only see them through a phone screen, we may not notice right away. We do not need to become perfect sons or daughters. No one can go home every weekend. No one can be at every dinner. Real life is not that simple. But maybe, if our heart keeps saying someday, the kindest thing we can do is give someday a real date, an ordinary Saturday, a longer phone call, a drive home for no special reason, a meal that is not for a holiday. Because sometimes the people who love us most do not need a big occasion. They only need to hear the car pull into the driveway, to place one more plate on the table, to see us walk into the kitchen and say, "I'm home." If today's story made you think of your parents, or of a place that used to be home, I hope you hold that feeling gently, not as blame, not as regret. We all have busy seasons. We all have months that pass too quickly. We all have promises we truly meant to keep, until life got in the way. But if there is still a chance today, maybe it can begin very small. A phone call that is not rushed. A message that says, "Are you home this weekend?" A date placed on the calendar. A trip home without a special occasion. Or simply saying, "I'll come," and then really going. Thank you for sitting with me today. I truly appreciate it. I wish peace for you and for the people you love. Until our next story, take good care of yourself. And if there is a place somewhere that still says, "Come when you can," maybe today is the day we stop answering. Next month. This is Companion, stories that remind us what truly matters.